Doru, Costache, a friend and colleague and member of the Theological Research Network. He is trained at Radu Voda Seminary in Bucharest in Romania. He's undertaken undergraduate studies and doctoral studies in Orthodox theology at the University of Bucharest. His doctoral thesis was on the anthropic cosmological principle interpreted from the viewpoint of the Patristic theologian Maximus the Confessor and the neo-patristic theologian Father Dimitri Stanilau. His 20 years experience in tertiary teaching. His research interests are early Christian representations of reality, traditional interpretations of Genesis 1-3, experience of holiness, well-being, science, ethics, theology. Is truly interdisciplinary. Thank you, Doru.
Oh, thank you, Neil. Okay. My talk, which some of you already know from the series of seminars that this conference concludes, is Affirming Creation's Goodness in a Time of Pandemic, Patristic Insights. I work since many years in patristic studies, which means early Christian theology, spirituality kind of stuff. For a while, I have been very interested in Byzantine medieval theology, spirituality, and so on. But of late, I realized the importance of early Christianity, given the similarities, or many similarities, between our own circumstances as more and more minority communities in a secular world and the early Christians. And I think there's a lot more that we can learn from the early Christians than from the so-called Christendom paradigms, East and West. So my examples, although I'll be mentioning a couple of Byzantines in this paper, my examples come mainly from the early Christian centuries. And why I look at these examples is not just because this is where I feel comfortable, that's my turf, so to speak, but because I have this sense of utter failure on the part of contemporary Christians in regard to facing strange, dangerous, unexpected circumstances like the pandemic. And I think there's a lot more that we can learn from the early Christians. At least this is the thesis that I'll be trying to substantiate in this talk. I have taken out some of the nasty things I said in my previous presentation of the paper about us contemporary Christians. Contemporary people, including many Christians, are unrealistic and unreasonable. They expect only good things. Yeah, that's mild. They expect only good things to happen in the best of all possible worlds, making no serious allowance for unpleasantness and difficulties. But as the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, and other natural catastrophes readily prove, not so in the real world, where the unexpected dangerous seems to be the norm. The early Christians were more realistic than this. They knew that the world, while good, insofar as it is God's creation, remains imperfect throughout its transition towards the eschaton, and indeed for all the ages to come. So imperfection never goes away, regardless of how much we might improve. And when we generalize Gregory of Nyssa's concept of epektasis, that's the plural of epektasis, existential leaps from one stage to the next, for the cosmos in its entirety, what results is the prospect of the creation continuing to move towards God for all eternity asymptotically. In other words, it's an endless process. At least this is the perception of a patristically minded Romanian theologian, Dumitru Stăniloae, for whom the eschatologically renewed universe will keep moving stably towards God on an endless pursuit of the fullness of life. It is true that the world will move differently in the age to come, he continues, advancing on a spiritual vertical, I quote, on a trajectory of spiritual convergence and towards the fuller assimilation of matter by the Spirit. But it will keep moving. And as Maximus the Confessor tells us, movement is the hallmark of imperfection. Perfection belongs to the Creator, not the created being, which, as we shall soon see, by nature is weak and mortal. Not even its future glory will amount to perfection, at least not in an absolute sense of the word. The early Christians also knew that there is a wild side to the created world, as to human nature itself, as within, so without. Accordingly, they were convinced that only insofar as we tame our inner selves will there be hope for the world to become, in turn and in time, gentler, as happened around the saints. Herein I consider several witnesses of the ancient Christian wisdom, from Theophilus of Antioch and Origen of Alexandria to Athanasius and the Cappadocians, and from John Chrysostom and Maximus the Confessor to Symeon the New Theologian. The last two are Byzantines. Seeking clues for a realistic appraisal of the natural world or past wisdom for contemporary issues. My focus is upon the Greek side of the tradition. The early Christians may have lived in a pre-critical age, as we keep saying, but they were not uncritical, undiscerning, and unwise. I have shown elsewhere that their grasp of reality was more comprehensive and sharper than our own. It's a book I published last year, April, which explains why, when it comes to the practicalities of everyday life, they were able to assess things and handle crisis better than we do. Hence my undertaking to mine their wisdom in search for the solution that seemed to elude us. For whether we like it or not, our reactions to unexpected situations such as the coronavirus pandemic betray an incapacity for facing reality, shelters as we have become in the womb of our civilization, and entitled as we feel to enjoy only good things. Our reactions, ranging from disbelief to irresponsibility to restlessness, have uncontrovertibly proven that the reassuring image of ourselves as mature exemplars of a critical age is wishful thinking. As C.S. Lewis had it, I quote, "People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that the thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time." It's a reference to Aslan. But the early Christians have been there, to Narnia, and were painfully aware of the truth that there is not one side to the world and everything in it. Accordingly, what they expected in this life were not endless enjoyment, good health, and increasing prosperity. What they were promised were afflictions, hardship, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, and sword. John 16:33, Romans 8:35. No welcoming havens for these travelers towards the age to come. The anonymous author of Letter to Diognetus, 2nd century, captured this view with utmost acuity. And they were aware that the creation itself, albeit scarred by people's failures and sins, continues to journey towards fulfillment, towards its future glory. Romans 8:18-23. No wonder they had quickly realized that the world and this life are imperfect, irrespective of how paradoxical this conclusion must have been. In short, the result of the Creator's perfection was not a perfect creation. And as they believed in God's perfection, they naturally wondered whether the Creator was unwilling to grant fullness, perfection to the creation. the question regarding the creation's contingency and imperfection was frequently repeated from mid-second century onwards. An external factor that prompted its repetition was the emergence of certain Gnostic pessimistic ontologies. For these Gnostics, more precisely, the world was the imperfect outcome of an unwilling, oblivious, and selfish deity that did not care about the cosmos. This pessimistic stance returned with the Manichaeans a little later, who postulated that an evil God made this imperfect universe. These ideas are the very opposite of contemporary optimism. Instead of expecting only good things to happen, therefore, certain Gnostics, but more so the Manichaeans, had no hopes about this world. But theirs was not the only solution to the problem. Mainstream or apostolic Christians, for example, approach the world's imperfections in two ways, neither of which resembles the extremes of naive optimism and downright pessimism. To these two approaches I must now turn by sampling the rich fields of the tradition. To begin with, Origen of Alexandria, who died about 254, endeavored to prove that the imperfection of the world, with its disparities, conflicts, illnesses, suffering, and death, was our own doing, people, not a natural defect of the creation, let alone of the Creator. Imperfection is the outcome of humankind's footprint, the Anthropocene. Otherwise, the cosmos remains a harmonious mirrored image of invisible beauties. In his words, I quote, "When we grasp the manner in which the divine wisdom established it, the creation of the world itself teaches us about the invisible things through visible things and images, transporting us from the earthly realms to the celestial ones." This is from his commentary on the Song of Songs. This kind of statement usually is taken to mean, well, these Platonists, they always dream about the other world, transcendent, and so on and so forth. In reality, what Origen says is, this world is good. It mirrors the divine. It mirrors the divine wisdom. It mirrors the divine plan. It's good. It is we who pollute it. So all this supposed Platonism or vulgar Platonism of many early Christian theologians should be discarded. I mean, the suspicion on our part. Even Plato, in more recent interpretations, told a very different story, not running away from the visible or this concrete material reality. It's a matter of discovering the fullness of things, the invisible. Origen's theodicy was not widely accepted, however, regardless of how appealing it might have been to some quarters, as it actually was for the 4th century Cappadocian theologians, who similarly construed evil as the outcome of our misusing free will. Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory, the theologian of Constantinople, supposedly of Nazianzus, bad framing. He was from there, but he wasn't bishop of there. These people denied the possibility of natural evil. I know this sounds crazy for some Christians, but they did not believe in natural evil. So Eastern Christianity stands elsewhere. Evil is a matter of bad morality, if you like. However, the Cappadocians' older contemporary, Athanasius of Alexandria, who died in 373, expressed the complex view that, while the matter of the universe is by nature imperfect, the Creator calls the creation to immortality. This was not Origen's theodicy. Instead, rehashing the Gnostic idea of a naturally deficient world that is so because of being brought into being out of nothing. The fact of having a beginning of existence means imperfection. It doesn't mean evil, it just means imperfect. Otherwise, Athanasius nurtured no pessimistic tendencies. I have plenty of references, but no time for that. His position seems to have expressed the view of many early Christians who did not expect the creation to be the best of all possible worlds. As we read in the New Testament, here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come, Hebrews 13:14. That said, and except for his desire to keep God above all suspicion, Origen himself believed that the universe, having a beginning of its existence, could not be perfect and immortal by nature. Instead, it entirely depends on God's providence to support its existence and to lead it to eschatological glory. This perception of the situation corresponded to his understanding that all created beings and the universe in its entirety, visible and invisible, continue to transition and to change until the end time. It is noteworthy that Origen's universe does not move without a definite goal. It moves towards stability, as well as a higher and more complex state. To that end, it follows a threefold process from beginning through the middle to the end. This is technical terminology, beginning, middle, end. A cosmological pattern Origen obtained by contemplating nature. This threefold schema denotes that the perfection of the created cosmos, albeit announced from before the ages, is a reality of the future. It has never belonged to the universe in the past, and it does not pertain to its present. So here is a big rift from the Western narrative of a perfect world, initially perfect, that was destroyed more or less utterly by the human fall. It's a very different equation. Fall is a reality, but what the fall has catalyzed in the order of things is not a fall from perfection to imperfection. Perfection did not exist. Several centuries after Origen, and copiously drawing on his worldview, Maximus the Confessor, who died in 662, represented the course of the creation according to the same threefold schema. In concord with the Alexandrian master, Maximus viewed cosmic perfection as an eschatological goal, not a reality of the past. Athanasius himself, while being a critical admirer of Origen, adopted his view of things, which he iterated under the guise of a discourse on God's providence. He reasoned as follows: as the universe is by nature weak, fluid, and mortal, that's a quotation, by nature weak, fluid, and mortal. The universe is not immortal by nature. It needs providential support on an ongoing basis. Nevertheless, this does not mean that God's input excludes the universe's natural energies. Origen and Athanasius converge towards affirming divine providence as active through creation's fleeting nature. God works gently with a cosmic mold, adapting the divine providential strategies to creation's parameters. No supernatural superseding nature. Origen and Athanasius also shared the conviction that the stuff of the world is by nature imperfect, and that it remains so for as long as the universe moves towards and into the eschaton. What matters here is that precisely this notion of cosmic imperfection, together with the idea of creation's dependence on God's ongoing support, led the early Christians to assess things in realistic fashion. As a result, they did not expect only good things to happen in this imperfect world, yet they remained fearless. Their strength, of course, originated in the awareness that God's providence watched over them. The early Christian realism exceeded awareness of the above. Deriving from the conviction that the creation is imperfect, the early Christians boldly addressed the ambiguities of nature and the dangers the natural world poses to human safety. Before I turn to the dangerous side of nature, it is perhaps useful to note that from very early, the early Christians sometimes represented nature and its ambiguity by way of metaphors. For example, Origen's interpretation of the fifth day of creation in Genesis 1 draws symbolic parallels between animals, aquatic and aerial, and sins and virtues. So, fish and birds, sins and virtues. Specifically, taken figuratively, aquatic life signifies sinfulness, while the birds denote the virtues. Aquatic life, especially the great whales, being fully adjusted to the natural milieu that imprisons them, as it were, deceive us as much as the waters do, since they hide from us. In turn, the birds are perfectly visible and free. Origen also associated ethical symbols with the terrestrial animals of the sixth day of creation. More precisely, corresponding to the great whales, terrestrial animals stand for our base impulses, while our upright position, which mirrors the freedom of the birds, denotes a capacity for transcending instinctual life and the vices. Beyond Origen's peculiar symbolic can be traced an ambiguity about animal life. Nature's lights and shadows, beauty and ugliness, gentleness and wildness, justify these and other parallels of this sort. But his interpretation is not unproblematic. Weren't all these beings, indeed the universe created by God and considered good? Seeking to respond in his homilies on Genesis, Origen avoided the speculative explanations he provided elsewhere in On the Principles, interpreting the goodness of creation as usefulness, which I believe corresponds to the Hebrew tov. The good of creation, tov, is actually usefulness, if I got it right. Thus, what seems evil might not be so if we pay attention to things. Even negative situations are good when, for instance, they help the saints to progress by having to face temptations, tests, and turmoil. Origen's take on goodness as usefulness reappears in Basil of Caesarea's homilies on the Hexaemeron. We assume that Basil died in 379. In an attempt to grasp creation's goodness or beauty, for that matter, since the Septuagint's kalos means both, so you read the Septuagint version of Genesis, instead of tov, goodness, you find kalos, which means both goodness and beauty. He points out the following, quote, "Beauty is that which is brought to perfection according to an artistic principle, but also something that secures the usefulness of its end. Nothing indeed is without a purpose. Plant life is useful directly as well as indirectly, for example, by nourishing the people and by feeding animals useful to humankind." Basil returns to the usefulness of plants by addressing the ambiguity, or rather the complexity, of our natural environment. Specifically, he explained that the same divine utterance, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation," produces both edible and poisonous plants. The fact that certain plants prove to be either poisonous or useless to us does not mean that they have no purpose. In his words, I quote, "There is not one plant without worth, not one without use. Either it provides food for some animal, or it has been sought out for us by the medical profession for the relief of certain diseases." No one has therefore a reason for begrudging God. The usefulness of things, even indirect, has proved to be for you an additional cause for thankfulness, says Basil. These stances correspond to his overall view that nothing is without a cause. Nothing is there spontaneously. Well, there's some randomness, of course, we know, but there is a certain ineffable wisdom in all things, he says. Almost another century later, Theodoret of Cyrus, who died in about 458, proposed a very similar argument. He dismissed the possibility of useless plants by showing that some of the inedible ones were food for certain animals, and that the latter were useful to human beings in many ways, from food to clothing to work. Thus, indirectly, all the plants were useful to humankind. Also, other plants were useful for medicinal purposes. Regardless of the way in which the plants were useful, directly or indirectly, they were serviceable to our race. He argued similarly for the usefulness of wild animals whose various parts were employed for obtaining healing substances. True, nature was ambivalent. there were elements such as water and fire that did good to humankind, but could also cause it great damage. But all things were ultimately useful within the overall functionality of the creation. Basil's younger brother, Gregory of Nyssa, who died in about 395, developed the perspective of creation's usefulness into a veritable system of the world. Divinely set forth, the order of creation follows a natural pattern which leads from the inanimate to the conscious, progressing through the stages of mineral, vegetal, animal, and intellectual existence. Each new level possesses the qualities of the previous one, to which it adds new traits. The last three types of existence are living beings, or, as Gregory preferred, different kinds of soul. He explains that at the last arrive, humanity recapitulates and reconfigures within itself these three types of soul into a higher order. He says the human being, this rational animal, mixes within itself all those forms of soul. So we are part of the whole, and the whole is part of us. Relevant to my purposes is Gregory's other explanation, teleological and utilitarian, that lower strands of reality are meant to serve higher forms of existence. The minerals do not just exist, they are made because of their usefulness to plants. The plants are made because they are useful to the animals. The animals are serviceable to humankind. In turn, humankind does not rule as an absolute monarch. Humankind's hegemony works through an ability to cooperate with the rest of the creation, first by taming some of its parts, and then by industriously making use of the beneficial qualities of the animals, plants, and the mineral world. This is actually people's single advantage over the animals, says Gregory, of which many are far stronger than the human beings, others are impossible to tame, and yet others are straightforward dangerous to them. While the world houses both humankind and the animals, cohabitation is neither easy nor uneventful. On this note, I must now turn to the early Christian perception of the creation as dangerous to humankind. Several decades before Origen, who consistently defended God's justice, wisdom, and goodness, Theophilus of Antioch, who died in about 180, proposed a related view, although he did not develop it as much as Origen did. What matters is that he believed that what caused the world's wild side, including the danger posed to certain animals, is human sin, or posed by certain animals, is human sin. The animals have not been made wild and dangerous. To represent this situation, he used the analogy of a household where the servants mimic the conduct of the master. At the root of this analogy undoubtedly lies the blessing of the sixth day of creation, by which humankind was appointed to rule over animals. Thus animals, the servants as it were, emulate the disobedience of the human beings, their masters, towards God, by becoming disobedient to people. In short, I quote, they disobey together with the disobedient humankind. Providence made that this disturbance of the natural rhythms was neither total nor definitive. Many centuries later, Symeon the New Theologian, who died in 1022, a millennium ago, proposed a similar explanation, while he produced a dramatic depiction of creation's rebellion against sinful humankind. According to him, immediately after the paradisal ancestors' fall, the world and its inhabitants either refused to provide people with means for life or attacked them. Only God's providence saved humankind from the onslaught, restoring the balance between people and the world in view of their common eschatological glorification. And while Theophilus, Origen, and Symeon understood the dangers posed to people by the wounded world as caused by their own anomalous life, undoubtedly echoing Romans 8:20. What matters is their acknowledgement that at least parts of the creation were not as welcoming to humankind as others. Theirs, however, was not the only way of representing the situation. Together with its imperfections, Athanasian Basil, and Gregory seem to have attributed the wild and dangerous side of things to nature itself. A tension becomes obvious at this junction. While all these authors acknowledge the wild side of the creation, their understandings of what generates danger differ significantly. It's like with today, climate change. Is it natural or man-made, or humankind-made? We think in terms of either or. These people apparently thought otherwise. The questions with which Origen concerned himself regarding the source of imperfection, disparity, and suffering in the world return in full force. Nevertheless, this time round, these questions do not refer to the topic of a good creator whose efforts resulted in an imperfect universe. Instead, they consider the inconsistency of the traditional voices which interpret this situation. Traditional, conservative. Indeed, two competing explanations have come to the fore. Certain early Christian authors, such as Theophilus, Origen, and Symeon, identify sin as the factor causing creation's dangerous wildness. For others, such as Basil and Gregory, perhaps also Athanasius, who exhibited a similar sense of the natural world, what makes parts of the world inhospitable is nature itself. Created nature, we must remember, is imperfect. The contrast is obvious, but are these positions mutually exclusive? John Chrysostom, who died in 407, implicitly demonstrates the opposite. John was troubled by the point of certain critics according to whom, while Genesis proclaims human lordship over animals, people actually fear them. This was a good reason for them to doubt the scriptural message. John wished to prove otherwise, and in so doing he arrived at an interesting solution. First, he addressed the outcomes of sin. While human rule over the world was a divine given, sin disturbed the order of things. Sin caused the loss of esteem and authority for human beings, leading in turn to their fear of animals. This conviction was widely shared by the ascetic literature of that age. Second, John showed that God made very good, tame and wild animals, as well as helpful and dangerous natural phenomena. All are very good. It is this balance in nature that is good, despite ambiguities. John could have borrowed this conviction from Basil's similar position earlier discussed. Either way, God made the wild animals so, namely wild, before the disobedience of humankind. John's two stances, that the wild side of the creation is divinely given and that sin increases nature's wildness, reiterate the tension mentioned above. John chose not to address this matter up front, but since he outlined them, he could have very well considered the two positions consistent. It is not difficult to see the logic of it. The natural wildness of certain animals became dangerous to and uncontrolled by humankind because of our sin. Wildness is neither naturally threatening nor totally dangerous to human beings. Only ignorance makes people, says John Chrysostom, only ignorance makes people suspect that God's creation is not a good world. Indeed, people fail to grasp the divine purpose concerning the things which they deem dangerous, much the way they ignore the existence of a balance in nature. Natural phenomena, animals, and plants, wrongly dubbed useless or dangerous, are nevertheless useful and good in the divine layout of the creation. John's conclusions coincide therefore with most of the examples discussed above, and together contribute to an overall positive, albeit complex and nuanced, assessment of the world. His stances and the views of his peers also coincide with a robust tradition of natural contemplation, which discovered another aspect of creation's usefulness as a school for souls, where the believers can discern traces of God's wisdom and activity. For those of you who can find my book, Humankind and the Cosmos, Early Christian Representations, that's especially chapter 5 Last but not least, I should point out that from Origen's homilies on Genesis onwards, almost invariably these positions paired with the sense that humankind needs to overcome its own wildness. In particular, John Chrysostom and the monastic literature emphasize the correspondence between personal tameness and the tameness of the environment. One might wonder, what has all this to do with the coronavirus pandemic? I believe that it has, and it is relevant to our current concerns and worries. Whether we like it or not, this virus, this invisible enemy, is part of God's creation. It might have mutated from some possibly benign ancestor, or it might have been all along there and we did not know of it. Or it might have been produced by our crafty hands, always ready to tinker with the forces hiding at the core of nature. Either way, the current health crisis, and I believe we are not out of the woods. I don't know why everyone behaves as though it's gone. Every day we have a few dozen Australians dying, let alone people in less privileged parts of the world. And not because of the war in Ukraine, they die because of this invisible enemy. So where's the victory? It's just this whinging of ours. We want back. We have normality. What's that normality? Normality is what we learn from these people, 4th century, 5th century, who knew that normal isn't comfortable. We live in a bubble. The great difference between the early Christians and us is, we saw above, the realism of their worldview and approach to things of everyday life, and our own unpreparedness for life and its unpleasant surprises. They knew the many facets of reality. In turn, C.S. Lewis again, people who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that the thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. And COVID might not be entirely bad. That's what I'll be saying in the last couple of minutes of reading. Is there anything good, therefore, about the coronavirus pandemic? There might be. Take, for example, the cleanness of the atmosphere after the lockdown, as well as many other benefits for the natural world, as evidenced by the documentary The Year Earth Changed, 2021, narrated by David Attenborough. Have you seen this one? They started to record around the world immediately after the lockdowns the first lockdowns were put in place, and they kept recording for a year. Immediate effects of our Sabbath, of our being locked down, with air pollution diminishing dramatically in a matter of weeks, couple of weeks. With examples, Shanghai, Delhi, and other places. With wildlife returning to the cities. Wildlife returning to the cities because there was no one there to trample on them and to honk and so on and so forth, to scare the hell out of them. And they recorded deer and penguins in Tasmania and New Zealand and all sorts of other things roaming the places. And we have no idea that they were there. And they returned. And as the documentary shows, they returned to where they used to feed and breed. Places that they could no longer access because of our, environmental management. It's not just about the cities. Safaris and cruises. They showed examples with a golf somewhere in Alaska, where it was, or it used to be, like a nursery for baby whales. And because of the many cruises going through and fro, the rhythms of the population, the whale population, were so much disturbed that the numbers dwindled to the point of reaching the bottom of extinction. In a few months, it was paradise for them. Another example, Florida Beach, where it used to be a breeding ground, whatever, for turtles, some kind of turtles, but they had no longer access to that favorite beach of theirs, and the numbers dwindled dramatically. In 1 year, the population managed to save itself to go beyond the threshold of extinction, and so many other things. Cheetahs in savannah. You know what they do? I have never been to a safari. Maybe it's fun stuff to do. They simply disrupt the normal rhythms of the wildlife. And there was this, I finish with this example, a family of cheetah. So the mother and 2 cubs. Dilemma. The cubs were there and had to stay there because the mother spotted some, whatever, target to kill somewhere, hundreds of meters away. The cubs could not come together with her. She managed to kill. Now there's the dilemma. What do? Do I leave my kill there to go and fetch my cubs? If I do that, someone else comes or something else comes and gets my food and the food of my kids. If I stay here to protect the kill, and I start screaming, shouting, doing noises, making noises, my neighbor, friendly neighbor, will come and kill my cubs. Safaris disrupt this link. In a natural order of things, the cheetah would do some kind of squeaky sound. The cubs could hear and come and get their food, but not with the safaris in place. There was so much noise, and they compared 2 years in a row. There was so much noise that the population of cheetahs dwindled before the pandemic, before the lockdown, dramatically. Why? Because the cubs could no longer hear the call of the mother. So are there good things about the pandemic and the lockdowns? Or take the heroism of the health workers, or the moving expressions of human solidarity, already mentioned here, of which we have learned in the previous months and a couple of years actually. Take also the revelation of certain world leaders' stupidity and irresponsibility, the bleach solution. Yes, lives have been lost. Life is precious, and hopefully the loss of so many lives taught us something about its true worth. Perhaps we all learned a little more about the weaknesses of the system in which we put our trust, or in the misguided faith of those who expect only good things to happen in the best of all possible worlds. Perhaps furthermore, people steeped in natural contemplation found theological insights behind the curtain of this tragedy. I hope that they discovered, or what they discovered is that the world is good, regardless of the extent of the crisis. Either way, the story whose illustrations I reviewed above remains the lesson whose wisdom we are yet to grasp.
Questions, comments? I'll start us off. A couple. I get the sense, and this is a question really about the patristic authors that you're quoting, and you talked about this sort of horizon of progress, and use the word eschatology in relationship to that. Do they have a sense of an apocalyptic edge to that, which is not like they seem to have it seems to present a world in a sort of evolutionary sort of perspective. But another strong biblical theme is apocalyptic, which is a historic sort of clash of forces of good, forces of evil, however you might want to talk about that, where there's a definitive outcome. That I didn't see that. I didn't hear that coming through.
Well, yeah, thank you.
There's also, like, there's a certain sense in which the church in which they're writing has become the church of the empire, has been domesticated to some extent. And that sort of apocalyptic vision, which has pretty strong political edge to it, may have been sort of pushed out of the way.
Thank you, Neil. Actually, some of the authors I refer to come from way before the empire or the imperial church. Not only Origen, Theophilus of Antioch, the author of the letter to Diognetus, and so on and so forth. And they lived under the strains and pressures of persecution and so on and so forth. And still, these people have a very realistic approach to things. Apocalypticism didn't die, and it has never died. But they had this sense that we need to take it with salt and pepper, especially the Book of Revelation and similar literature. And to my knowledge, if there's such a thing as mainstream interpretation of the Book of Revelation in the first Christian centuries, that's more of an immediate prophecy of the fall of Rome under the gospel. So the conversion of Rome. So all those cosmic battles that we see in the Book of Revelation actually amounted to metaphors, allegories of the conversion of the empire. So they did not literally expect that kind of stars falling from the heavens, although they knew of meteorites. They did not expect, I think, a literal end of the world the way we might think they would, a cessation of things. And even in the New Testament, if you look at the end of the second letter of Peter, it must be chapter 3 or so, the language is highly metaphorical of a world, a creation that is dismembered, diselemented, and then reassembled. So it's not something like annihilation and so on and so forth. Of course, it might be painful for the contemporary of such events, the contemporaries of such events. But I don't think that this is how they understood apocalypticism. I think they focused more on the final pages of the Book of Revelation with the city of God coming down from heaven, and the new shape of things, transfigured sense of reality is in place. But my point here is that even so, these people did not believe in the perfection of the world, of the creation. It can't be perfect since it has a beginning of its existence. It can be better. It will be better. That's our hope. But it can never reach perfection, not in an absolute sense. It can't be God. Even though God becomes all in all, as we see in the first of Corinthians 15, it can't be God. The world isn't God. But it moves forever towards and into God. And this makes things better for all of us, including those parts of the creation that we consider non-human and inferior to us. Yes, Father?
Is there any set that's building on from that movement, that sort of evolution, if you like, of creation? What do you, the fathers, what's the thought? Does it happen of itself? Is it just set off from God? Is God intervening constantly to bring it to it? What about human responsibility for
Thank you. That's a very good one. As a matter of fact, they did not believe in the autonomy of the world. And perhaps you remember the example I have given from Origen, that kind of theodicy. If there's anything bad in the world, it's because of us, not because of God, regardless of how imperfect the world might be. However, thinking in terms of that evolution, development, growth of the world towards maturity, it's a synergetic process that is in place at the fundamental levels of the creation. What we call the natural world is never deprived of the presence of the supernatural, the support of the supernatural. That's the perspective of Athanasius of Alexandria. In the backdrop of all natural phenomena, we have to find, and we will find if you look attentively, God's signature and presence. And it's not interventionist, it's continuous, it's ongoing. So the divine support for this entire process is an ongoing phenomenon, but the entire evolution itself is somehow orchestrated. Although there's room for randomness, evolution is orchestrated. It happens, as Sarah pointed out earlier, within a logos. There's a logos of things, of all things, which somehow guides from within all things and the universe towards that divinely designed goal.
Can we frustrate that?
Oh, definitely. Freedom is real and impactful. And Origen's theodicy is actually based on the idea of misusing free will. The Cappadocians, iterated the same kind of narrative, that we can make things worse. Our sin catalyzes the imperfection or deepens the imperfection and wildness of the creation, and all things turn towards us. I could not give you, quotations of that because it would have been too long. But Symeon the New Theologian in the 11th century has this beautiful, moving image of an entire world with animals and even the sky and the earth and the air collapsing on the heads of Adam and Eve in retribution for what they did, and Adam and Eve, all of us, yeah? And it's only God's providence that intervenes to keep things somehow afloat.
Doru, when you were talking about how they understood the goodness of creation in terms of beauty but also usefulness, it sounded a bit as though the goodness was connected to its usefulness to us, even if not directly, indirectly, because, but does that, that sounds like a fairly anthropocentric vision of the goodness of creation. Does that, in a sense, is that part of the problem is that we see it that way?
I see your point. An esteemed colleague from East Coast, but also a Queenslander, Professor Peter Harrison, has written extensively on this. And in his books and articles, he speaks of the wrong way of understanding anthropocentrism, because it's one way in which we modern people understand anthropocentrism, and it's a different way in which anthropocentrism was understood by the early Christians. They were very pragmatic, which we aren't. We think we are, but we aren't. We are very idealistic. All good things happen to me, and until whatever. They were anthropocentric, which, although I prefer anthropic, so thinking in terms of a human conditioning of the universe. The universe is made as a home for us. That was their perception. And many of the responses that I found in early Christian theologians are circumstantial. They refer to certain worries, I think I mentioned a few of those worries. There were people who objected to one of John Chrysostom's homilies. How can you speak of the goodness of creation and our overlordship when we fear animals, when we fear natural phenomena? Is our sovereignty compatible with the reality of our fear, and so on and so forth? And the answers that these people gave were tailor-made for those worries. So we shouldn't take these responses as systematic theology in a modern sense, where you make a whole exposition of how things should be or whatever. They were triggered by certain worries of the time. What I think is positive about these responses is the realism behind many of them, regardless of how we understand anthropocentrism. I'd like to see the world, or I prefer to understand the world as made for me, because I need to feel at home. And this was actually a worry of many early Christians. So I'm anthropocentric by design, so to speak. But does that mean I have to behave as an overlord and a despot to kill everything in my path because I want to secure my own well-being? This isn't what we read in these sources.
You can see that tension played out in Laudato Si.
The papal encyclical, yeah.
Because there's a wanting to assert the intrinsic value of created beings, and at the same time recognise the special place of humanity within that. And it's a sort of moderated anthropocentrism that he sort of ends up in, or a moderate anthropocentrism, while recognising that extreme forms of anthropocentrism are just destructive. Some of the people in the environmental movement would criticise him for that, I think, becoming at that position. He mentions biocentrism as something that he's not promoting. But Mick, you might have something to contribute to that.
Yeah, I always come back to, I remember reading many years ago someone talking about the environmental movement as a whole as being overly romantic, precisely because they weren't very realistic about it. But when you turn to something like Psalm 104, and it says that God feeds the lions, and a lot of what it talks about, the stalks and the trees and so on, are entirely out of the human economic system. And in the case of the lions, potentially deleterious to it. So there's a lack of romanticism in that scripture, and it's one of the few places you might argue that's more biocentric, I think, in scripture in its vision.
Yeah, if you go earlier in the book of Psalms, is it Psalm 4 or so? You see the human being above all things and all that. But I repeat, it's not the word anthropocentric. It's what we mean by it. Yeah. Of course, we no longer believe in the fact that we can kill anything kicking and moving just because we are the overlords. We no longer believe that. I don't know if anyone did believe that, say, a millennium ago. I still think it's useful to think psychologically for us that the world is made for us. This doesn't exclude anyone else.
I guess I wasn't thinking so much of that tension between your anthropocentrism or biocentrism, and I take the point about realism in the sense that we actually do think only from our perspective, and how could we think otherwise, Yeah. But I guess I was just thinking a little bit about that. I guess that sense of the healthy detachment or kind of apathy of recognising the goodness of something independently of its goodness for me. You know, like being able to kind of value the world because it's independent of me and has its own independently existing life, and love it for that, rather than having to translate through its usefulness.
Yeah. Well, I hear and I subscribe to the same view, and I found similar views in Basil's Symeon, for example, who praises the life of animals and plants as such, not because of me. But remember, these people were still foreigners. They were still persecuted minority. So 4th century isn't the golden age of anything. They were still a minority. They were still persecuted. They were still derided, and they had to feel somehow important and at peace and at home. This is God's creation. No wonder the strong doctrine of creation that we still have to this day emerged then. It's important to think or to place all this discussion about the early church in that historical, sociological, cultural, psychological context to make sense of what these positions actually mean, so that we are not anachronistic in our appraisal of what they said. But yeah, I believe, yes, we have to rediscover the value of things as God's creation.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.